Hello and welcome to this session on quick compositing in Affinity Photo. My name is James and I'm the product expert for Affinity Photo. I'll show you a series of quick techniques you can utilize to take several individual images and blend them together to make one final image. Now for this, I'm using some images from a photo bashing pack. Photo bashing is a little bit like using stock imagery, except all of the photographs are sourced from the same location and typically with the same camera and lens combination. So it's really easy to blend these different images together. And it's great for practice or just throwing together creative ideas as well. So I'm going to start with this image here as my base background image. Then I've chosen this image here for the foreground. So we're just going to extract the foreground from this image. So let's just drag drop it into Affinity Photo, offer it anywhere over our current document, like so, to place it. And then we need to move across to the layers panel here to see our layer work. By the way, just out of preference, I will switch to medium thumbnails as well. Okay, so to position this composite layer, we can use V for the move tool and then just move it around. I like to turn on snapping, so then I can snap to the vertical middle point of my document. Okay, and then I can just bring this up until I'm happy. A great tip actually is to use the number keys to quickly set opacity of the layer that you're working on. So 5 for 50% opacity. Then I can just choose with more accuracy where I want to position this layer. And as it turns out, I think I'm happy with it just about here. Then 0 to get back to 100% opacity. And now what we need to do is add an empty mask layer. So to do that, we can hold Alt or Option whilst clicking on the mask layer icon. Then we need to paint back in to the areas where we want this image to show. So B for the paintbrush tool, Control and Option on Mac or Control Alt on Windows, and click and drag to set the width and hardness. And then on color, we just need to make sure we're set to white. So X to toggle over to the white color here and just brush in like so. Now, if you go too far, that's not a problem. Just toggle to black, so X again, and then just paint back over to hide these areas. Okay, that's our foreground in. Now let's replace the background. So I've got another image here, similar composition, but slightly different. So let's just drag this in, offer it over the top here, V for the move tool, let's snap this into place. Then once again, we'll use our opacity trick, so 50% opacity, or whichever value you find works for you. And we want to line up this lake with this lake, roughly, in terms of the horizon line. There we go, that looks about right. So then 0 to set it back to 100. And this time we'll add a full mask. So just click mask layer, don't hold Alt or Option. B for the paintbrush tool, we're set to black, and we're just going to subtract away from these areas here. Like so. Okay, we've gone too far here. So make the brush smaller, X to toggle across to white, and just paint back in over these areas. Okay, looking good. Now you'll notice with this image, if I use V for the move tool, you can see because of the bounds here, I've actually got some information outside of my current crop. So if I wanted to, I could actually expand the height of my composition. To do that, I can use C for the crop tool. I can check reveal up here, and this shows me the areas outside of my current crop. So let's move this up and hit return. There we go, I've got more sky. Okay, so now let's make this composition a bit more interesting and put a castle in. So this image tonally is different. We're going to have to work around that. Not a problem. And also, I'm going to drag this in, but I'm not going to place it. I'm going to open it as a separate document. So to do that, we just offer it anywhere over the interface and not the document, like so. Okay, once that's loaded, we will use W twice to get the selection brush tool here. Use my modifier to increase the brush width, and then I'm just going to brush in and create a quick selection of the castle and the surrounding areas. Now, generally speaking, even though we're not going to be using these areas, I will include them in the selection. It's always good just to have a bit of, extra room or extra play for when we're doing some additional masking. Now, we have a bit of an issue here. We have some sky detail peeking through here, which we need to exclude from the selection. And also we've got these chimneys and perhaps some other little incidental details as well. This is where we use selection refinement. So we click refine up here. It's already matted these areas for us. That's great. We don't have to do any work there. The chimneys, we just need to drag over them to matte them. And then we'll just do the same for these little crosses at the top here. And I think everything else, including this foliage, is pretty much good to go. So let's just drag over these chimneys again, see if we can't get a slightly better result. There we go. Okay. Now the other important thing is the output. We want to choose new layer or new layer with mask because these two options perform color decontamination. And that is where the color from the background is disregarded. So what we don't want is like a bluish or whitish halo around the edges of our cutout. So to avoid that, we want new layer or new layer with mask. We can click apply, and then we will have our cutout. Let's just rename this, call this castle, and then we can copy this, so Command C on Mac, Control C on Windows, and paste it into our main document. So V for the move tool, let's position this where we want it. I might scale it up slightly as well. And let's just drop it somewhere around about here, I think. Although we can always move this after the fact if we're not happy. Okay, now let's tackle some masking. Let's add a mask layer. And B for the brush tool, set my color to black. And just paint in here. Okay, now we've run across a problem. We're using a nice soft round brush, which is fine for, masking away these areas. But when it comes to more intricate detail, a soft round brush just doesn't look very convincing for blending. So what we want is something more textural, and luckily we have something like that that ships with Affinity Photo. So let me just go into the brushes panel up here, go across to the masking category, and here we have a couple of textured brushes. And these are great because, I'll just show you quickly, they have like a randomized texture nozzle, and it's great for getting a more textural feel to edges where you're blending away. I've gone too far there, so let's use X and paint back in. Okay, and then I can just go across these areas with my color set to black, you can see here. Okay, and it just helps blend these layers in a little bit more convincingly than we would have been able to if we were just using a nice soft round brush. Okay. All right, now we might come back and revisit that masking, I'm not sure yet. It depends what happens when we do some more tonal work on the whole document. But for now, we want to blend this castle in tonally with its surroundings. So I'll show you a couple of different techniques to achieve this. One is to use a curves adjustment with channels. So let's add a curves adjustment, drag that and clip it into the castle layer. So to do that, we want to offer it to the text to the right here. You can see I get that horizontal blue bar. When you get the truncated blue bar, that's the one you want. And now, on the channels panel, we want to isolate each channel individually. So let's isolate red by clicking on it. And we want to go for our red target here on the curves adjustment. And I'm just going to bring this up. But our goal is to match the contrast. So you'll see by bringing this down, I can match the contrast of the red channel of the castle layer to the surrounding areas. Don't just match to the immediate area, but also look at the overall image as well. Does the contrast work in terms of the overall scene? Is the question that you need to ask. Okay, let's do the same for green. So green on the curves dialog, composite green down here. We can see this needs some attention, so let's bring this node up again and also just bring this down. I have to bring this down further than the red channel to make the contrast match. And then let's do the same for blue. Wow, that's a big difference. So now we need to do the same for blue and bring that down as well until it looks roughly like it can match these surroundings. So now this is the big reveal, the big moment. When I reset the channels so we can see all of them, hopefully, yes, there we go. The contrast and also the colors somewhat look much more believable. So let me show you the before and the after. There we go. Okay. Another little technique that you can also employ is to use something like a gradient map adjustment. So let's add a gradient map above the curves adjustment. This looks absolutely hideous by default, but don't worry. What we want to do is we've got the dark tones, the midtones, and the highlights here, and we want to map these to similar tones in the rest of the image. So let me choose the red color here, go into my color dialog and color pick something dark, basically. Let's choose a dark tone over here. That assigns it to my color picker. I just click that to assign it to my stop. Okay, and then for the green, let's pick a nice reddish midtone, something like this. Assign it. And for this particular layer, there aren't really any meaningful highlight details, but all the same, for any workflow, you would want to do the same for the highlights. So let's get the blue and color pick off a nice bright highlight of the sky and assign that, okay? Now with the gradient map, what we want to do is set the blend mode to something like color. You can experiment with this, by the way, but I tend to go for color. That's obviously far too strong, so now what we need to do is use a very low opacity. So let's try 20%, okay? And I really need to zoom in to show you this difference. Let me show you the before and the after. Oh, that's so subtle. Let's try 40% opacity. But now you see that's too strong. It doesn't look as believable. So let's just stick with 20%. So that's a really subtle change, but it just helps, every little adjustment you can make contributes to the overall believability of your composition. Okay, moving on then, let's do some more tonal work. And when we do some more tonal work, this will also give us a better idea of whether we need to revise our blending for the castle layer. So let's add a curves adjustment. So Command M on Mac, Control M on Windows. And I'll just create a couple of nodes here, and I'm just going to push these tones up for something a bit more dramatic. There we go. It's perhaps looking a bit too dark, so let's bring this bottom node up slightly, like so. There we go. Okay, I think that looks all right. Let's tweak the colors now. So my preferred adjustment for color work is Selective Color. You can do very dramatic alterations with it, but at the same time, you can be really subtle with it as well. It's incredibly powerful. So on Selective Color, for example, if I've got the reds selected, I could increase the cyan contribution, and that actually kind of mutes the red tones somewhat, which you might prefer. You might want a really kind of drab, dark looking image. Let's try bringing the yellows to the left as well. If we switch across to the yellows, we might take some of the yellow contribution out, and that gives it more of a kind of a reddish, magenta-ish tone. I perhaps don't like that, so I'll be very careful with that slider. But then probably the most dramatic thing we can do is tint the black tones. So for example, if I bring cyan up on the blacks and yellow down, I end up creating this kind of blue tint or color cast over the entire image. Okay. So, we can close that down, and then if we decide that perhaps that's a bit too strong, don't forget that as well as just going back in and changing the parameters, we can also control the opacity of the layer. So let me type 5 for 50% opacity, and you can still see before and after that, we can kind of make some very subtle adjustments there. Here it is at 100% opacity. Perhaps that's almost too drab for me, so let's try 60%. There we go, that's a nice middle ground. Now the next thing I'll do is reshape the tones in the image somewhat. Basically, this is like non-destructive dodging and burning. So if I add a pixel layer, pick up the paintbrush tool, cross on my brushes panel, I just need to make sure I have a nice soft round brush on the masking selected, and then just increase the brush width somewhat. Make sure I'm set to white, so X to toggle across to white there. And this pixel layer, I can set the blend mode to overlay, and then take the opacity down to maybe something like 25%. And this enables me to just brush into certain areas to accentuate these areas, and then I can quickly use X to toggle across to black, and then I can just remove the emphasis from other areas by darkening them, like so. So let me just show you the before and after for that, because it's actually quite dramatic when you see it. Here's the before and the after. Okay, you know what? The image is still looking a bit too kind of drab and dark. I might want to brighten it. And sometimes, you know, you don't always have to use curves. Don't overlook brightness and contrast, because it's incredibly powerful in its simplicity. If you just want to brighten everything, you can just use the brightness slider. And then as a result, if it perhaps looks a bit too washed out, we can add back in some contrast, you know, some drama, some punch, like so. That's perhaps a bit too bright, so not a problem. I can just take that back. And sometimes, you know, simplicity is really all you need. By the way, at this point, this castle is perhaps looking a bit too reddish, maybe. So another little technique we can use, if I just go back into the child layers for the castle layer here, is we can use a white balance adjustment. I use this all the time because it's just incredibly useful and quick to change the temperature of a layer's tones. So I could just drag this to the left slightly, like so, and perhaps also experiment with the tint. Okay, and again, that's just really subtle. Here's the before and the after. You can barely see that, but in the overall composition, it does make a difference. Now, finishing touches, let's add some atmosphere, some haze. I've got two dust cloud layers here. I'm just going to drag this in, place it over the top, like so. V for the move tool, just bring it down here and set the blend mode to screen. But I kind of want to stretch this out a little bit. So I can actually stretch or do non-aspect correct scaling by dragging the top, bottom, left or right nodes, and I can hold Command on Mac, Control on Windows to resize around the center. So that gives me a really quick way of just stretching from the middle. There we go. Let's set the opacity to maybe 40%. And then we'll add another dust cloud on top of that. Just drop that in like so. And do the same thing. Set the blend mode to screen, position it down here, and then stretch it out all the way like so. Opacity down to 40. And that adds some nice kind of a suggestion of like hovering mist. Let me just show you the before and the after. Maybe that's too strong, so with both layers selected, let's do 2 for 20% opacity. Then let's add some kind of mist going up towards the top of the image, and for that I will use a fill layer. So layer, new fill layer. I use these all the time. They're incredibly useful. They are non-destructive vector fill layers. And when you create a fill layer, you have the gradient tool selected for you. So now I can just draw out my gradient like so. And actually for the bottom node, I want to set that to pure white. And the top node, I want to set to pure black, like so. And then set the blend mode to screen. Okay, and you can play around with the positioning of these nodes as well. But now all I need to do is just take my opacity down to maybe 20%. And as you can see, if I just hide this by using the View tool, which is H on the keyboard, you can see I just add this nice kind of misty haze over the sort of the foreground of the image here. Okay, I think we are probably about done. One final thing I will do though is non-destructively again, add a live clarity filter. This child layer is by default, so let me just drag it out here and double click it again to get back to the settings. I'll bring the strength up to 100. This adds a load of drama and intrigue. You know, it kind of enhances structure or texture, but we don't want it over the entire image. So with clarity selected, I will use invert. So Command I on Mac, Control I on Windows. B for the brush tool, and then I just need to make sure I'm on white here, and I can paint back in over the areas where I want that clarity to apply. Okay, let me just quickly show you the before and the after. Okay, and I think I'm done. Maybe just one final curves adjustment to tweak those tones again, like so. But again, I might come back to this at a later date. That's the beauty of completely non-destructive editing in Affinity Photo, is that we can save this document, just collapse all of these so you can see, come back at a later date, and everything back to our very first operation is just there on the layer stack. Here's our final composition, and I'm going to save this, and I might come back to it later. And I might go, oh no, what was I thinking? It's too bright. The castle doesn't look right. I've got the tonal blending wrong, that type of thing. It's amazing because you can just come back with a fresh perspective, take a break from what you're doing, because, it's quite intense when you just sit here editing, and then come back and, make any revisions that you might need to, because everything is here ready to manipulate. For example, I could go in to these two dust cloud layers, and perhaps they're too strong. I might take the opacity down to 10%, for example. Just little changes that make a big difference here. Anyway, that is me done. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've picked up some useful tips and techniques. Thank you and take care.